John Harper was the image of a man burdened by invisible scars. At 35, he looked much older than his years, with deep lines framing his tired blue eyes and a perpetual stiffness in his posture, as though bracing for an unseen impact. His decade-long service in the U.S. Army had included 3 harrowing tours in the Middle East. Though his uniform had been folded and stored away for years, the battlefield remained etched in his memory. Nightmares of explosions and the haunting cries of fallen comrades kept him awake long after the world around him had gone quiet. Returning to his hometown in Arizona after leaving the military, John thought he might find peace in the wide-open desert skies and the familiar hum of cicadas at dusk. But civilian life felt like stepping into a world where he no longer belonged. The camaraderie of his fellow soldiers was replaced by long stretches of isolation. To fill the void, John took up woodworking projects in his garage and went on solitary hikes through the rugged desert trails. These activities helped, but only briefly. The ache of disconnection remained. Sarah Harper, John's older sister, was his lifeline. Living in Phoenix, she had watched her brother struggle to reintegrate into civilian life, his smile growing rarer with each visit. Sarah, practical to a fault and fiercely protective of John, knew better than to press him too hard about his feelings. But one Saturday morning, over a cup of coffee in her modest kitchen, she decided it was time to speak up. "John," she began, her voice steady but gentle, "you can't keep going like this. You're not yourself anymore." John glanced up from his mug, his brows furrowed. "I'm fine, Sarah. I just need some time. Time isn't a cure-all, you know? You need something, someone, maybe, to remind you what it's like to feel connected again." He leaned back in his chair, his skepticism evident. "Someone? Like I'm ready for that." Sarah smiled faintly, leaning forward. "I'm not talking about people, John. Have you ever thought about getting a dog?" "A dog?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Sarah, I can barely keep myself together. How am I supposed to take care of a dog?" "Not just any dog," Sarah pressed. "Do you remember Max?" John's chest tightened at the name. Max had been his K-9 partner in the military, a loyal German shepherd who had saved his life more times than he cared to admit. But Max had been injured during their last mission together and retired while John remained on active duty. The thought of Max brought a bittersweet ache. "Of course, I remember Max," John said, his voice softening. "But he's long gone, Sarah. That chapter's closed." Sarah hesitated, then reached for her phone. "You know, there's an animal shelter not far from here. They specialize in taking in retired service dogs. You could go. Just to look." John shook his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, Sarah. What do you have to lose?" she countered, her tone growing firmer. "The worst that happens is you walk out the same way you walked in. But maybe, just maybe, you find something worth holding on to." John stared at his coffee, the steam rising between them like an unspoken challenge. After a long silence, he finally nodded. "All right," he said, his voice low. "I'll think about it." Sarah smiled, relief washing over her. "That's all I'm asking." As John drove back to his modest home on the outskirts of town that evening, he found himself replaying Sarah's words. The idea of going to the shelter felt both daunting and strangely hopeful. For the first time in months, a faint flicker of purpose stirred within him. Little did he know, that decision would lead him to an encounter that would change both his life and the life of an old, familiar companion. The animal shelter Sarah mentioned was tucked away on the outskirts of Phoenix, a modest facility surrounded by a chain-link fence and shaded by a few scattered mesquite trees. As John pulled into the gravel lot, he hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the otherwise still afternoon. He sat there for a few moments, debating whether to turn back, before finally stepping out. The heat hit him like a wall, the dry desert air pressing against his skin. He adjusted his baseball cap and headed toward the entrance. The lobby was small but welcoming, with colorful posters of adoptable dogs and cats plastered on the walls. A friendly woman behind the counter greeted him with a warm smile. Her name tag read Lisa. "Hi there. How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice cheerful. John shifted uncomfortably, shoving his hands into his pockets. My sister said you guys work with retired service dogs? Lisa's eyes lit up. We sure do. Are you looking to adopt? I'm not sure yet, he admitted. Just thought I'd take a look. Well, you've come to the right place. Follow me, and I'll show you around, she said, motioning for him to follow. As they walked through the narrow hallway lined with kennels, the cacophony of barking and whining echoed in John's ears. Lisa led him to a quieter section at the back, where a row of dogs rested in shaded outdoor pens. Most of these guys are retired from the military or police work, Lisa explained. Some adjust to civilian life quickly, but others, well, they need a little extra patience. John's eyes scanned the pens, taking in the wary gazes of the dogs. Some paced nervously, others lay curled in the corners, their bodies tense. But then his gaze landed on a familiar figure. It was Max. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized the scar above the dog's right eye, the patch of lighter fur on his flank. Max's once proud demeanor had given way to a guarded stillness. The German shepherd lay motionless in the corner of his pen, his eyes dull and distant. Lisa noticed John's reaction. You know him? John nodded slowly. Yeah, his name's Max. We served together. Her expression softened. He's been here for a few months now. He was transferred from another facility after his previous adoption didn't work out. Poor guy's been through a lot. John crouched down by the pen, his heart pounding. Max, he called softly. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. John tried again, his voice steadier this time. It's me, buddy. It's John. Max's eyes flicked toward him briefly before he turned away, resting his head on his paws. The lack of recognition stung, a sharp reminder of the time and trauma that had passed. Lisa placed a hand on John's shoulder. He's still in there, somewhere. It just takes time. John straightened, his jaw tightening. I'll take him. Lisa blinked, surprised. Are you sure? He's going to need a lot of care. He's not the easiest dog right now. I'm sure, John said firmly. We've both been through hell. If anyone can help him, it's me. The adoption process took about an hour, during which Lisa explained Max's medical history and the adjustments he might need. When the time came to take Max home, John knelt beside him, leash in hand. All right, buddy, he murmured. Let's get you out of here. Max hesitated but eventually stood, his movements slow and deliberate. As they walked to the truck, John kept his pace steady, not wanting to rush the dog. Once inside, Max settled onto the seat, his head resting against the window. The drive home was quiet, the air filled with an unspoken tension. John glanced over at Max occasionally, remembering the dog's strength and loyalty during their time in the field. He had saved John's life more than once, guiding him through dangerous terrain and alerting him to threats. But now, Max seemed like a shell of the dog he used to be. As they pulled into John's driveway, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Rebuilding the bond they once had wouldn't be easy. But as John opened the truck door and Max hesitated before stepping out, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't give up on his old friend. The first few days with Max were harder than John had anticipated. The house felt quieter than usual, though it now held 2 inhabitants. Max moved cautiously, his large paws silent on the hardwood floors, his presence a shadow that seemed both there and not. John had set up a space for Max in the living room, a soft dog bed in the corner, a few new toys, and a water bowl beside it. Despite the effort, Max rarely used the bed. Instead, he preferred to lie near the front door, his eyes fixed on the threshold as if waiting for an order that would never come. On the second night, as John sat at the kitchen table eating a simple dinner of pasta, he glanced toward Max. The dog hadn't moved from his spot near the door all evening. You hungry, buddy? John asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. John sighed, pushing back his chair and walking to the cupboard. He grabbed a can of wet food the shelter had recommended and spooned it into a bowl. Setting it down a few feet away from Max, he backed off to give the dog space. Take your time, he murmured. It took nearly 10 minutes for Max to move. He approached the bowl cautiously, sniffing it before finally eating. John watched, his chest tightening. Max was alive, But he wasn't living. Not yet. The days that followed were a mix of small triumphs and lingering challenges. Max allowed John to clip a leash onto his collar for short walks around the neighborhood, but his steps were slow, his head low. Neighbors would wave or call out friendly greetings, but John rarely responded, focusing instead on giving Max space to adjust. One afternoon, Sarah stopped by unannounced. She knocked lightly before stepping inside, carrying a bag of groceries. "John? I brought some stuff for dinner," she called, her voice cutting through the stillness. Max, startled, jumped to his feet and let out a low growl, his body stiff. Hey, easy," John said, stepping between Max and Sarah. He crouched beside the dog, his hand on Max's back. "It's okay, buddy. She's family." Max's growl subsided, but his eyes remained wary as he retreated to his spot by the door. Sarah set the bag on the counter, her brow furrowed. "He's on edge," she observed. "Yeah," John replied, standing up. "He's been through a lot." "So have you," Sarah said pointedly. John shook his head. "This isn't about me. He's the one who needs help." Sarah crossed her arms. "And what about you, John? You're putting everything into Max, but when are you going to let someone help you?" John's jaw tightened. "I'm fine." "Are you?" she pressed. "Because you look as shut down as he does." John didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked to the back door, letting it slam shut behind him as he stepped onto the patio. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the desert horizon. After a moment, he heard the door open behind him. "Look, I'm not trying to push you," Sarah said softly. "But you don't have to do this alone." John exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know how to fix him," he admitted. "Every time I look at him, I see what we used to have. And now, it's like he doesn't even know me." Sarah stepped beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Maybe he doesn't need you to fix him. Maybe he just needs you to be there, one day at a time." John nodded slightly, her words sinking in. That evening, John tried a different approach. Instead of coaxing Max to interact, he simply sat on the floor nearby, flipping through an old photo album. The sound of pages turning seemed to pique Max's interest, and he shifted slightly, watching John from the corner of his eye. "You remember this?" John said aloud, holding up a picture of himself in uniform with Max by his side. "This was after that mission in Fallujah. You were the only one who didn't flinch when the mortars hit. You kept us moving, buddy." Max's ears twitched, and for the first time, he looked directly at John. Encouraged, John pulled out another photo. "And this one? This was the day we got paired. I thought you'd never listen to me, but you proved me wrong." Max let out a soft huff, almost like a sigh, before resting his head on his paws. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, for the first time, Max didn't sleep by the door. Instead, he curled up on the bed John had set up in the living room. As John watched from the couch, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to find their way back to each other. The early morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains in John's living room, casting golden patterns on the hardwood floor. Max lay curled up on the dog bed, his chest rising and falling steadily. John, already awake and nursing a cup of black coffee, watched him from across the room. The sight of Max using the bed for the first time since coming home gave John a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a start. He set his mug on the counter and reached for a box stored in the hallway closet. The box was old, its corners battered from years of being shuffled between moves. Inside were relics of his time in the military, badges, maps, and, most importantly, Max's service vest. John carried the vest to the living room and knelt a few feet from Max. The German shepherd stirred slightly but didn't lift his head. "Morning, buddy," John said, his voice low and calm. He placed the vest gently on the floor between them. "Thought you might want to see this." Max's nose twitched and he opened one eye, glancing briefly at the vest before closing it again. John frowned but didn't push. Instead, he sat down cross-legged on the floor and let the silence settle between them. Later that day, John decided it was time to try something familiar. He pulled out a toy from the same box, a faded rubber ball Max used to carry during their missions. Back then, it was more than a toy. It was a tool for focus, a way to keep Max grounded during stressful operations. He held the ball out toward Max, who was lying near the door as usual. "Remember this?" John asked softly. Max opened his eyes but didn't move. John sighed, rolling the ball gently across the floor. It stopped a few inches from Max's paws. "No pressure, buddy," he murmured. "Just thought it might help." To John's surprise, Max sniffed the ball. He didn't pick it up, but the brief interaction felt monumental. "Good boy," John said, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. The next day, John decided to take Max to a quiet park on the edge of town. The drive was uneventful, the silence between them punctuated only by the hum of the truck's engine. When they arrived, the park was nearly empty, save for an older couple walking their terrier in the distance. John grabbed the ball from the passenger seat and clipped the leash onto Max's collar. As they walked along a dirt path, the breeze carried the scent of mesquite and wildflowers. It was the kind of place John hoped might stir something in Max, a memory, a spark, anything. They reached a small clearing where the morning sun filtered through the trees. John crouched down and held up the ball. "All right, let's give this a shot," he said. He tossed the ball a few feet away, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Max watched it bounce, his ears twitching, but he didn't move. "It's okay," John said encouragingly. "Take your time." After a few moments, Max took a tentative step forward, then another. He sniffed the ball, nudging it slightly with his nose before looking back at John. "That's it, buddy," John said, a smile breaking across his face. Max didn't pick up the ball, but the fact that he approached it at all felt like a victory. That evening, as they settled in back home, John sat on the couch flipping through a book. Max surprised him by walking over and lying down closer than he had ever done before. John set the book aside and reached out a hand. "Hey, Max," he said softly. Max hesitated, then leaned forward to sniff John's fingers. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 words. For the first time since bringing Max home, John felt a glimmer of the bond they once shared. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The road ahead was still long, but in that moment, John knew they were heading in the right direction, together. The days stretched into weeks, and the small gestures from Max began to add up. Each moment felt like a small victory, a glimmer of the unbreakable bond they once shared. But John was still careful not to push too hard. He knew trust couldn't be rushed, especially after everything they had been through. One crisp morning, John decided to try something new. He rummaged through the storage box in his hallway closet and pulled out a training whistle, one they had used back in their deployment days. The whistle was a simple tool, but it carried with it a language they both understood, a language of partnership and precision. Standing in the backyard, John whistled a short, familiar sequence. Max, who had been lying in the shade of a mesquite tree, lifted his head. For a moment, his ears perked and a flicker of recognition crossed his eyes. "Good boy," John said, crouching down and holding out the rubber ball. "You remember, don't you?" Max stood slowly, his movements tentative. He approached John with measured steps, his nose twitching as he sniffed the ball. Then, with a surprising burst of energy, he grabbed it in his jaws and backed away a few steps. John chuckled, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. "Look at you, showing off," he said, watching as Max dropped the ball at his feet. He picked it up and threw it gently across the yard. Max hesitated, his body language tense as he watched the ball roll into the grass. But then, almost as if something clicked, he bounded after it, retrieving it and bringing it back to John. "You're still in there," John murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. For the first time, Max leaned into the touch, his tail giving the faintest wag. Later that evening, John called Sarah to share the news. "He fetched the ball today," he said, his voice lighter than she'd heard in months. Sarah's excitement was palpable through the phone. "That's amazing, John. I told you he just needed time." "Yeah," John agreed, glancing at Max, who was lying on his bed chewing the rubber ball. "It feels good, you know, like we're finding our way back." "I'm proud of you," Sarah said, "and of Max. You two are a good team." John smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Thanks, Sarah. I couldn't have done this without you." The next day, John decided to take their progress a step further. He brought Max to a nearby park with open trails and fewer distractions. It was a place he often visited alone, but now he had a companion by his side. As they walked, John practiced some of the old commands he used to give Max during their missions. "Heel," he said, and Max slowed to match John's pace. "Sit," he commanded, and Max complied, albeit with a moment of hesitation. "Good boy," John praised, his tone warm and encouraging. They continued down the trail until they reached a small clearing with a view of the distant mountains. John sat on a large rock, letting the desert breeze wash over him. Max sat beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon with the same alertness John remembered from their days in the field. "You always were the best partner," John said, his voice tinged with both pride and melancholy. "I don't know what I would have done without you back then." Max turned his head toward John, his eyes meeting his handler's for a brief but powerful moment. It was as if the dog understood every word. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of peace. The trauma and loss that had haunted him didn't disappear, but having Max by his side made the weight easier to bear. That night, back at home, Max did something that surprised John even more. As John sat on the couch reading, Max stood, walked over to him, and rested his head on John's lap. John froze, the book slipping from his hands. He reached down, gently running his fingers through Max's thick fur. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his throat tightening. "You're really coming back to me, aren't you?" Max let out a contented sigh, his eyes half closed. It was a moment John would never forget. A small but significant gesture that spoke volumes about trust, healing, and the enduring bond between a man and his dog. The days began to take on a rhythm, a quiet but comforting cadence that revolved around rebuilding their bond. Mornings were spent on long walks through the neighborhood, where Max gradually grew more at ease with the world around him. John noticed how Max's body language had started to shift. His tail wasn't always tucked, his ears no longer pinned back as much. One morning, as they walked past a neighbor's yard, a Labrador bounded toward the fence, barking excitedly. Max froze, his posture stiff, his muscles coiled like a spring. John knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on the dog's side. "It's okay, Max," he said softly. "You're safe." Max let out a low growl, but he didn't lunge or retreat. Instead, he stood his ground, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Good boy," John murmured, keeping his voice calm. He waited until the Labrador lost interest and wandered off before continuing their walk. Each step felt like progress, no matter how small. Back at home, John decided to try another familiar exercise. He pulled out a set of training cones he'd borrowed from the shelter, setting them up in a makeshift course in the backyard. "All right, Max," John said, patting his leg. "Let's see what you've got." He used the whistle to signal Max to follow him through the course. At first, Max hesitated, his movements slow and uncertain. But as John guided him with a combination of verbal commands and gestures, the dog began to respond more confidently. "Good job, buddy," John said as Max weaved through the cones with surprising agility. "You haven't lost it, have you?" Max's ears perked up slightly, and for the first time, John saw a glimmer of the proud, focused dog he remembered from their time in the field. That evening, John and Max settled into their routine. John cooked a simple dinner, grilled chicken and vegetables, while Max lay nearby, watching him with curious eyes. After they both ate, John decided to call Sarah. "Max did a training course today," John said, leaning back in his chair. "Seriously? That's incredible." Sarah's excitement was infectious, and John couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, he's starting to come around. I mean, he's still not the same dog he was, but there's progress. That's all that matters," Sarah said. "Sometimes it's not about getting back to who we were. It's about finding a new version of ourselves." John paused, her words hitting closer to home than he expected. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You're right." That night, as John prepared for bed, he noticed something unusual. Max was pacing near the bedroom door, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "What's wrong, buddy?" John asked, crouching down. Max whined softly, his body language restless. John opened the door, letting Max wander into the hallway. The dog made his way to the living room and stopped in front of the old photo album John had left on the coffee table. John followed, his brow furrowing in curiosity. He knelt beside Max, picking up the album. "You want to look at this again?" John asked, flipping it open. Max sniffed the pages as John turned them, pausing at a picture of the two of them during their first mission together. In the photo, John was kneeling beside Max, one hand resting on the dog's back, both of them looking tired but determined. John smiled faintly. "You were a damn good partner, Max." "Still are." Max let out a quiet huff, his head resting on John's knee. For the first time, John felt a sense of mutual understanding, a bridge slowly being rebuilt between them. They weren't the same as they had been, but they were learning to navigate this new chapter together. The following morning, John woke up to find Max curled up beside his bed. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how far they'd come. "Good morning, buddy," John said, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "Ready for another day?" Max stretched, his tail giving a faint wag. As John stood and began preparing for the day, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose. With Max by his side, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues across the desert landscape as John and Max made their way to a larger park on the outskirts of Phoenix. This park was different. Sprawling open fields, sparse crowds, and a small, tranquil pond surrounded by mesquite trees. John had chosen it intentionally, hoping the space and calm atmosphere might stir something in Max. The park's air was filled with the distant laughter of children and the rhythmic thud of a jogger's shoes on a dirt path. Max walked beside John, his leash slack, his posture more relaxed than it had been weeks ago. As they reached an open field, John unclipped Max's leash. He crouched down, holding the rubber ball that had become a constant companion during their outings. "All right, buddy," John said, his voice steady but encouraging. "Let's see what you've got." He threw the ball, not far, just a gentle toss. Max's ears perked up as he watched it land a few feet away. For a moment, he stood still, his body tense. Then, something shifted. With a burst of energy, Max took off, his powerful legs propelling him forward. John's breath caught as Max grabbed the ball in his jaws and trotted back, dropping it at his feet. "Good boy," John exclaimed, his voice breaking with emotion. He crouched to meet Max's gaze, ruffling the fur around his neck. "That's my partner." Max's tail wagged, a real wag, not the half-hearted movements of previous weeks. For the first time in years, John saw a flicker of the dog he once knew. Encouraged by the progress, John decided to try another familiar activity. From the trunk of his truck, he pulled out a sturdy rope toy, a favorite of Max's during their military training days. He held it up, showing it to Max. "Remember this?" Max's eyes followed the toy, his body language alert but curious. John knelt down and held one end of the rope. "Come on, buddy," he said, giving it a gentle tug. Max hesitated, then clamped his jaws around the other end. He pulled lightly at first, testing the game. When John tugged back, Max responded with more force, his tail wagging enthusiastically. John laughed, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that felt foreign and freeing. "There you are," he said, his voice filled with warmth. They played for several minutes, the tug-of-war growing more spirited with each round. When Max finally let go and flopped onto the grass, panting but content, John sat beside him, the rope still in his hands. "Look at us," John said, scratching Max's head. "We're getting there, aren't we?" Max let out a soft huff, his body stretched out lazily in the sun. That evening, as they returned home, John couldn't shake the feeling of hope that had been growing inside him. He cooked dinner while Max lay in the kitchen, watching him with attentive eyes. "You're spoiling me with all this progress," John joked, glancing down at Max. "Don't think I didn't notice you wagging your tail today." Max tilted his head, his expression almost amused. After dinner, John sat on the couch with a beer in hand, the television playing softly in the background. Max, who had been resting on his bed, stood and walked over to him. He placed his head on John's knee, looking up at him with eyes that seemed brighter than they'd been in months. John set his beer down and rubbed Max's head. "You're really coming back to me, aren't you?" Max's tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. For the first time, John felt a deep sense of connection, not just with Max, but with himself. The process of helping Max heal had started to heal him, too. The following morning, John decided to visit Sarah and share the good news. As he and Max approached her house, Sarah stepped outside, her face lighting up when she saw them. "John," she called, hurrying down the steps. Her eyes widened when she noticed Max walking confidently beside him. "And look at you, Max." John smiled, unclipping Max's leash as they reached the yard. "He's been doing great," John said, his pride evident. Sarah crouched down, holding out her hand. "Hey there, big guy." To her delight, Max approached and sniffed her hand before allowing her to scratch behind his ears. "Wow," Sarah said, looking up at John. "He's like a different dog." "Not different," John corrected, his tone thoughtful. "Just finding himself again. Like we both are." Sarah stood, her expression softening. "I'm so proud of you, John." "Both of you," John nodded, glancing at Max, who was now exploring the yard with a curiosity he hadn't shown in years. "We still have a long way to go," he said. "But for the first time, it feels like we're getting somewhere." Sarah smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing more than getting somewhere. You're rebuilding something incredible." John didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched Max, a quiet sense of gratitude settling over him. "You're right," he said finally. "We are." The sun hung high in the sky as John loaded Max into the truck. Today, they were headed somewhere special. A sprawling park near the outskirts of Phoenix, one with trails that led through a quiet, rocky terrain. John had chosen this place deliberately. It resembled the environments they had trained and worked in during their years together in the military. As they drove, John glanced at Max in the rearview mirror. The German shepherd sat upright, his ears alert, a contrast to the withdrawn posture he'd had weeks ago. "You ready for an adventure, buddy?" John asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Max let out a soft bark, his first vocalization in weeks, and John chuckled. "That's what I like to hear." The trail was nearly deserted, save for the occasional hiker in the distance. John parked the truck near the trailhead, grabbed his pack, and clipped the leash onto Max's collar. They walked in companionable silence, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. The air smelled of sage and sun-warmed earth, and the vast, open space seemed to energize both of them. About half a mile into the trail, John stopped and knelt, pulling out Max's old military vest from his pack. He held it out to the dog, letting him sniff it. "Remember this?" John asked, his voice soft. Max sniffed the vest, his ears twitching. He didn't recoil or shy away, which John took as a good sign. "You wore this through everything," John continued, running his hand over the worn fabric. "It made you a part of the team, and you were the best damn partner anyone could have asked for." Max sat still, watching John with an intensity that felt like a flicker of recognition. John smiled and carefully fastened the vest around Max's torso. "There," he said, stepping back. "You look good, buddy." Max stood tall, his posture shifting slightly as if he understood the significance of what he was wearing. They continued along the trail, and John began issuing simple commands from their old training days. "Sit." Max obeyed immediately, his movements fluid. "Stay." The dog froze in place, his focus sharp. "Come." Max trotted to John's side, his tail wagging faintly. "Good boy," John said, crouching to rub Max's ears. "You still remember." For the first time, John saw not just glimpses but whole pieces of the dog Max had been, the loyal, fearless companion who had once led him through some of the darkest days of his life. As they reached a clearing, John decided to push things further. He unzipped his pack and pulled out a decoy used for scent training. It was an object Max had trained with countless times, a small pouch filled with a familiar-smelling fabric. "Let's see if you've still got it," John said, holding the decoy in front of Max. He walked a short distance away, letting Max watch as he placed the decoy under a small bush. Then, he returned to the dog's side and gave the command. "Find it?" Max hesitated for only a moment before lowering his nose to the ground. He sniffed the air, his movements becoming more confident as he followed the scent trail. Within seconds, he stopped at the bush and nudged the decoy with his nose before grabbing it in his mouth. "Attaboy!" John exclaimed, clapping his hands. Max bounded back to him, dropping the decoy at his feet and looking up with an expression that bordered on pride. "You still got it," John said, kneeling to embrace the dog. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail, John and Max made their way back to the truck. Sitting on the tailgate, John cracked open a bottle of water and poured some into a collapsible bowl for Max. The dog drank eagerly, his tail wagging. "You know," John said, leaning back against the truck bed, "I didn't think we'd ever get back here. But you've proven me wrong every step of the way." Max looked up at him, his amber eyes bright with trust and something else. Gratitude, maybe. For the first time in a long while, John felt a weight lift from his chest. They still had a journey ahead of them, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. That night, as they returned home, John sat on the couch with Max lying at his feet. He opened the photo album again, flipping to a picture of them taken during their first mission. "You know," John said, holding up the photo, "we've come a long way since this." Max nudged John's hand with his nose, his tail wagging slightly. John smiled, setting the photo aside. "And we've still got a long way to go. But as long as we've got each other, I think we'll be all right." For the first time in years, John felt truly hopeful, not just for Max, but for himself. The weeks following their trip to the park were marked by steady progress. Max had become more responsive, his personality shining through in small but meaningful ways. John noticed the wag of Max's tail when he heard the jingle of the leash, or the way he followed John from room to room with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. But John wanted to take things further. He wanted Max to experience a taste of real freedom, something both of them had been deprived of in their own ways. So, on a warm Saturday morning, John packed up the truck again. This time, they were heading to a dog-friendly nature reserve just outside Sedona. As they pulled into the gravel lot, John glanced at Max, who was sitting alert in the passenger seat. "You're gonna love this, buddy," John said, smiling. "Wide open spaces, no fences, no limits. Just you and the world." Max let out a soft bark, his excitement unmistakable. The trailhead opened into a sprawling field bordered by red rock formations. The scenery was breathtaking, the kind of place that demanded you pause and take it all in. John clipped Max's leash onto his harness as they started down the path, but his plan wasn't to keep it on for long. After about a mile of walking, they reached a secluded clearing near a small creek. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the soft hum of cicadas. John knelt down and unclipped Max's leash. "All right, buddy," he said, meeting Max's eyes. "You're free. Just stay close." For a moment, Max stood still, his ears perked and his nose twitching as he took in the unfamiliar scents. Then, with a burst of energy, he darted forward, his paws kicking up dirt as he ran. John watched, his chest tightening with emotion. It wasn't just the sight of Max running that moved him. It was the sheer joy in the dog's movements, the way he leaped over rocks and splashed through the shallow creek without hesitation. "You look good out there," John called, his voice echoing through the clearing. Max turned briefly, his tail wagging, before bounding off again to explore. After about half an hour of running and playing, Max trotted back to John, panting but happy. His coat glistened in the sunlight, and his eyes were bright with life. "Had enough?" John asked, crouching to give Max a scratch behind the ears. Max responded by nudging John's hand with his nose, a gesture that felt both familiar and new. "All right, let's take a break," John said, pulling a collapsible bowl and a water bottle from his pack. He poured some water for Max, who drank eagerly, then took a seat on a nearby rock. As Max lay down at his feet, his head resting on his paws, John stared out at the red rock formations in the distance. He thought about how far they'd come, not just in the past few weeks, but over the years they had known each other. "You know," John said, breaking the silence, "I used to think I was saving you. Back in the day when we were out there, I thought I was the one keeping you safe. But now I realize it's the other way around. You've been saving me all along." Max lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting John's. It wasn't just a look. It was a connection, a silent understanding that spoke louder than any words could. The drive back home was quiet, both of them content in the way that only exhaustion from a good day can bring. Max lay sprawled across the back seat, his head resting on the armrest, his breathing slow and steady. When they arrived, John let Max inside and prepared a simple dinner. As he cooked, Max lay in the living room, his tail thumping softly against the floor whenever John glanced his way. That night, as John settled onto the couch with a beer, Max did something he hadn't done before. Instead of lying on his bed, he jumped up onto the couch and sat beside John. "Well, this is new," John said, smiling. He reached out to rub Max's head, and the dog leaned into his touch, his eyes closing in contentment. John set his beer on the table and rested his hand on Max's back. "You're a good boy," he said softly. "You've always been a good boy." Max let out a quiet sigh, his body relaxing against John's. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The following weeks were filled with a new rhythm, one that felt almost natural, as though the weight both John and Max had carried for years was slowly lifting. The walks became longer, the training sessions more engaging, and the quiet moments at home more comforting. Each day was a testament to the strength of their bond and their mutual journey toward healing. One afternoon, as John sat in the garage repairing an old chair, Max wandered in, his tail wagging faintly. John glanced up, smiling at the sight of the dog exploring the cluttered space. "Come to help, buddy?" John asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Max sniffed at a pile of tools before settling at John's feet, his head resting on his paws. John chuckled. "You've got the supervision part down, that's for sure." Later that day, as the sun began to set, John decided to take Max back to the park near Phoenix. This time, he brought along an old Frisbee, a toy Max had loved during their military training days. At the park, the air was cool, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple. John threw the Frisbee, watching as it sailed through the air and landed a few yards away. Max hesitated for only a second before taking off after it, his powerful legs propelling him forward. When he reached the Frisbee, he grabbed it in his jaws and sprinted back to John, his tail wagging furiously. "Good boy," John said, laughing as Max dropped the Frisbee at his feet. "Still got it, huh?" They played until the sky grew dark, the sounds of laughter and barking echoing through the quiet park. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of lightness, a joy he thought he'd lost forever. That night, back at home, John sat on the couch with Max lying beside him. The television was on, but John wasn't paying much attention. Instead, he was focused on the dog curled up against his side, his breathing slow and even. John ran a hand through Max's fur, his voice soft. "You know, when I brought you home, I wasn't sure if we'd ever get back to this. But you proved me wrong, buddy. You always do." Max opened his eyes, looking up at John with a gaze that was warm and steady. "Thank you," John whispered, his throat tightening. "For everything." Max let out a quiet huff, resting his head on John's lap. The following morning, John decided to take Max to Sarah's house. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah stepped outside, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "Look at you too," she said, walking over to greet them. Max wagged his tail and sniffed Sarah's outstretched hand before leaning into her touch. "He's like a whole new dog," Sarah said, smiling at John. "Not new," John corrected, his voice thoughtful. "Just whole again." Sarah looked at him, her expression softening. "And you?" John nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Getting there." As they sat in Sarah's backyard, watching Max explore, Sarah turned to John. "You know," she said, "watching you two reminds me of something Mom used to say. Healing isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about learning to carry it differently." John stared at Max, his heart full. "I think we're figuring that out together." Sarah reached over, giving John's hand a squeeze. "I'm proud of you, John." "And of Mac." "Thanks," John said, his voice quiet but steady. That evening, as they drove home, John reflected on how far they had come. Max had taught him more than he ever thought possible. not just about resilience and trust, but about the power of connection and the importance of showing up, even when things felt impossible. When they arrived home, Max jumped out of the truck and trotted toward the house, his movements confident and sure. As John watched him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Max, but for the journey they had shared. "Come on, buddy," John called, stepping inside. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." Max wagged his tail and followed, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the porch light. For the first time in years, John felt ready for whatever lay ahead. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.